The Senate will come to order. Mr. Panetta, please call the roll.
Bridges. Buckner.
Present.
Coleman. Coram. Coram.
I'm not hearing anything. Here.
Cook. Cook. Danielson.
Good morning.
Donovan. Fenberg.
Hello.
Fields. Fields.
I'm
Absent.
Gardner. Janal. Gonzalez. Hanson. Heisey. Holbert. Hawkes Lewis.
Morning.
Kirkmeyer. Colker. Lee. Liston. Lundeen. Lundeen.
No committee reports on that.
Thank you very much. Get ready for a fun one.
Absent.
Moreno. Pedersen. Priola. Rankin. Rodriguez. Scott.
here.
Simpson. Smallwood. Sonnenberg. Story. Winter. Woodward.
Excused.
Zenzinger. Fields. Lundeen. Mr. President,
Here. With 34 present, 0 absent, and 1 excused, we have a quorum. Would the good senator from Denver please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, good morning. Please join me in saying the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Approval of the journal. Senator Hawkes Lewis.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. President. I move the reading of the Journal of Thursday, March 18th, 2021 be dispensed with and the journal be approved as corrected by the Secretary.
You have heard the motion. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Senate Services.
March 19th, correctly printed Senate Bills 184 and 185, correctly enrolled SJR 005.
Committee reports.
March 19th, Committee on Appropriations. After consideration of the merits, the committee recommends the following: House Bill 1164 be referred to the committee to hold a favorable recommendation. March 18th, Committee on Judiciary. After consideration of the merits, the committee recommends the following: Senate Bill 23 be postponed indefinitely. March 18th, Committee on Judiciary. After consideration of the merits, the committee recommends the following: Senate Bill 124 be amended as follows: so amended, be referred to the committee to hold with favorable recommendation. March 18th, Committee on Judiciary. After consideration of the merits, the committee recommends the following: Senate Bill 66 be amended as follows, and so amended, be referred to the committee to hold with favorable recommendation. Recommendation be placed on the consent calendar. March 18th, Committee on Agricultural and Natural Resources. After consideration of the merits, the committee recommends the following: Senate Bill 164 be postponed indefinitely. March 18th, Committee on Agricultural and Natural Resources. After consideration of the merits, the committee recommends the following: Senate Bill 135 be amended as follows: so amended, be referred to the committee to hold a favorable recommendation. March 18th, Committee on Judiciary. After consideration of the merits, the committee recommends the following: Senate Bill 64 be amended as follows: so amended, be referred to the committee on Appropriations with favorable recommendation. March 18th, Committee on Education. After consideration of the merits, the committee recommends the following: Senate Bill 13 be amended as follows: so amended, be referred to the committee to hold with favorable recommendation, with recommendation to be placed on the consent calendar.
General order, second reading of bills. Consent calendar. Senator Bridges.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move the Senate resolve itself into the Committee of the Whole for consideration of General Order's second reading of bills, consent calendar.
You have heard the motion. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. The Senate will resolve itself to the Committee of the Whole for consideration of General Order, second reading of bills, consent calendar, and Senator Bridges will take the chair.
The committee will come to order and the court rule is relaxed. Will the clerk please read the title of all the bills and the General Order's second reading of bills, consent calendar?
Senate Bill 117 by Senator Moreno and Representative Michael Janae concerning consistent procedures between schools and county departments of human resources relating to students and out-of-home placement. Senate Bill 153 by Senators Coleman and Cook and Representatives Ortiz and Tipper concerning a program to assist offenders with acquiring state-issued identification.
Majority Leader Fenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move for the adoption of all the bills on the consent calendar and their associated committee reports, including Senate Bill 117 and Senate Bill 153, along with its State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee report.
Is there any discussion of the bills on the consent calendar? Seeing none, the motion before the body is the adoption of all the bills on the General Order's second reading of bills, consent calendar. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, no. Ayes have it, and those bills are adopted. Majority Leader Fenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move the committee rise and report.
The motion is for committee to rise and report. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Committee will rise and report.
The Senate will come to order. Senator Bridges.
Thank you, Mr. President. The committee has had a number of bills under consideration. Will the clerk please read the report?
Mr. President, your committee of the whole begs leave to report has had under consideration the following attached bills, being the second reading thereof, and makes the following recommendations thereon. Senate Bill 117, Senate Bill 153 as amended, passed on second reading and ordered engrossed and placed on the calendar for third reading and final passage.
Senator Bridges.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move the report.
The motion is for the adoption of the Committee of the Whole report. Are there any no votes? With a vote of 34 ayes, 0 noes, 0 absent, 1 excused, the Committee of the Whole report is adopted. Senate Bill 117, Senate Bill 153 as amended, passed on second reading, ordered engrossed and placed on the calendar for third reading and final passage. General order, second reading of bills. Senator Bridges.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move the Senate resolve itself to the Committee of the Whole for consideration of General Order's second reading of bills.
You have heard the motion. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. The Senate will resolve itself to the Committee of the Whole for consideration of General Order, second reading of bills, and Senator Bridges will take the chair.
There we go. You have the book up there?
Hi, is there a committee report or? 155. 155, okay, cool. There you go. Sometimes I forget. Or, sorry, I just move it. And then we do. And then move the amendment to the bill. And then I'll say to the amendment. I know, we forget that shit. Well, we have to. I went back to the, we're doing it. I said, just display it, or whatever, and I came back.
The committee will come to order and the coat rule is relaxed. Will the clerk please read the title to Senate Bill 155?
Senate Bill 155 by Senators Heisey and Representatives Amabelli and Basie concerning the appointment of a resident of a locality and limited gaming takes place to Limited Gaming Control Commission.
Senator Heisey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move SB 155 and ask for an aye vote.
Is there any discussion? Seeing none, the question before us is the adoption of Senator Heisey. Oh, here we go. There is an amendment at the desk. Will the clerk please read Amendment L002?
Amendment L002 to Senate Bill
Senator
155.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me tell you what the bill is about so that the amendment makes some sense. But this bill adds a resident from each of the gaming counties to the Limited Gaming Commission. No, actually, the bill adds one. The amendment adds two. So what we'll be voting on is adding a member from each county.
Thank you for that succinct explanation. Is there any further discussion of Amendment L002? Oh, Senator Heisey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move Amendment L002.
So moved. You have already discussed it, along with a little bit of the bill. Is there any further discussion from any of the members here in the chamber? Does the minority leader have something to add? No? Excellent.
No concern here.
Seeing no further discussion, the question before us is the adoption of L002. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. To the bill. Seeing no further discussion, the question.
Thought we did just assume.
You sure? Senator Liston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, I sit on the local government committee, and I want to commend the sponsors for getting together on this bill. I think it makes perfectly good sense, especially with this amendment. I think it brings good representation, and I would urge the members to vote aye on this Senate bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you. For the record, members, my eyesight is not great. If you would like to speak on a bill, please be in the well. Don't raise your hand from the back. I just don't see very well. So thank you. Moving forward, that would be much appreciated. Again, it's just a poor vision on my part. Seeing no further discussion, Mr. Minority Leader would not like to speak. Seeing no further discussion, the question before us is the adoption of Senate Bill 155. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Ayes have it. That bill is passed. Will the clerk please read the title to House Bill 1083?
House Bill 1083 by Representatives Benavides and Senators Priola and Zenzigo concerning the modification of appeal of property valuation set by the County Board of Equalization.
Senator Priola.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, I move House Bill 1083. There is no committee report.
To the bill. Seeing no further discussion, the question before us is the adoption of House Bill 1083. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Ayes have it. That bill is adopted. Mr. Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move the committee rise and report.
Question before us is to rise and report. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, no. Ayes have it. The committee will both rise and report.
The Senate will come to order.
I didn't bring my packet. 1 second.
Yeah, this is not yet special. You're doing a committee. This is, we got to confirm the committee report. Exactly.
The committee did meet, though, and it had a number of bills under consideration.
A number.
He'll read the report.
A number 2 bills. It's early. It's early. I'm waiting there. Now we're ready.
The Senate will come to order. Senator Bridges.
Thank you, Mr. President. The committee has had a number of bills under consideration. That number is 2. Will the clerk please read the report?
Mr. President, your committee of the whole Vegas League report has had in consideration the following attached bills, being the second reading thereof, and makes the following recommendations thereon. Senate Bill 155 as amended, passed on second reading in order and gross and placed on the calendar for third reading and final passage. House Bill 1083 passed on second reading in order, revised and placed on the calendar for third reading and final passage.
Senator Bridges.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move the report.
The motion is for the adoption of the committee whole report. Are there any no votes? Senator Lundin. With a vote of 33 ayes, 1 no vote, 0 absent, 1 excuse, that motion is adopted. Senate Bill 155 is amended, passed on second reading, in order and gross and placed on the calendar for third reading and final passage. House Bill 1083 passed on second reading, in order, revised and placed on the calendar for third reading and final passage. Special order, second reading of bill. Senator Bridges. Excuse me, Mr. Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, we are going to take up a brief special orders calendar. I'll make the motion and then we'll take a quick break just to make sure everyone understands what's going on and what bill we're referring to and all of that. Actually, let's take a quick huddle before I make that motion, but we will be, the intention is to bring up House Bill 1164 on special orders, second reading of bills. Mr. President, I move that the Senate stand in a brief recess to discuss.
You have heard the motion. Seeing no objection, the Senate will stand in a recess. The Senate will come back to order. Mr. Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the Senate take up House Bill 1164 on special orders at the hour of 9:36 a.m.
The motion is that the Senate take up House Bill 1164 at the hour of 09:36. This requires a two-thirds majority vote. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the motion is adopted, and the Senate will take up House Bill 1164 at 09:36. Special orders. Second reading of bills. Senator Bridges.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move the Senate resolve itself in committee of the whole for the consideration of special orders, second reading of bills.
You have heard the motion. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it, the motion is adopted. The Senate will resolve itself in the committee of the whole for consideration of special orders, second reading of bills, and Senator Bridges will take the chair.
Why is there a report?
Because it went to appropriations.
But there was no amendment.
Oh, I thought it still had to have, but you're right, yeah. So there's no reverse. Oh my God, it's even more simple.
Is it on?
Yeah.
The committee will come to order and the court rule is relaxed. Will the clerk please read the title to House Bill 1164?
House Bill 1164 by Representatives Esgar, Garnett, and Senators Zenzinger and Fenberg concerning reductions in the property tax credits applied to school districts' total program mill levies for purposes of funding the Public School Finance Act of 1994.
Senator Zenzinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move House Bill 1164. Good morning, colleagues. Today we are very privileged to be able to present to you House Bill 1164, a bill that we hope will correct a long-standing error in our property tax system that funds our school finance. It's actually quite a simple bill. It's merely 2 pages. What it does is it directs CDE to implement a correction plan for the erroneous reductions in mill levies by beginning to incrementally phase out mill levy credits starting in 2021-22 fiscal year. CDE's plan must apply consistently to each affected school district, and tax credits will be phased out slowly at no more than 1 per year, meaning that all credits will be fully phased out by the year 2040. Because the phase out of these credits brings a fundamental constitutional question into play about voter approval, this bill forms the basis of an interrogatory that we hope to send to the Colorado Supreme Court this session via a separate but related resolution, which will come hopefully later this morning, to assess the constitutionality of the proposed mill levy corrections. And we ask for an aye vote.
Senator Fenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, I echo everything my co-prime here said about this bill. This is a simple bill about a complicated issue, but the impact on the ground is profound. We are now in a situation where we used to have relative consistency across districts when it comes to mill levies, and now it's all over the place. It's a patchwork, and it's resulted in a very unfair distribution of state funds throughout our state. And we all, I think we have unanimous support in this chamber for making sure that we fund education adequately and fairly, and that our kids are taken care of, our teachers are taken care of, all of our support staff are taken care of. And unfortunately, we are not doing it in a fair manner right now. This is due to, as the good senator from Jefferson County mentioned, that this is due to a complicated series of events from the Department of Education, and essentially something that was forced upon our districts across the state that they really had no choice about. And due to case law, we believe that this was an error and should be corrected, and there should be in place a process for correcting this error to get us on a better path for more fair and equitable funding of our education system across the state. This is not the first step. This has been a conversation we've had for years. This is also not the last step. As discussed, this is going to be just the next step. And we hope that this will eventually be in the hands of the Supreme Court to give us more guidance so we can have a more robust and fuller discussion around the issue, around the way to correct it, and the path forward for the state of Colorado. And we urge an aye vote on this bill.
Series of unfortunate events. I believe there's a Netflix show on that. Senator Lundin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I rise in opposition to the bill, and I do appreciate very much the most basic framing that you've received, and that is this is a very simple bill with a very complicated underlying subject. And it's in that complexity of the underlying subject that I find opposition to this bill. As you know, everything we do here is essentially political in nature. There are pushes and shoves, there's tugs and pulls. There are things that we do in a small way that can have a big strategic effect in the long term. This bill, I believe, would create the potential for relief on a piece of the education funding formula that is desperately in need of revision. And that is, it may provide relief to the question of, should we be funding special needs students with a greater proportion of the dollars we are spending? Should we be spending a greater proportion of the dollars we are spending for at-risk students? You have heard me argue many, many times that the way we fund education must become, because it is not today, about the students and not about a system. This bill at its very heart is an effort to protect a system and resist the changes so necessary to properly support those students. Now, in the committee yesterday, we heard this bill just yesterday in committee, although the conversation has been alive for a long time. And there are good-willed people with very different perspectives on both sides of this argument. One of the smartest people on this issue testified yesterday and framed up the conversation saying there is disequity in our funding formula, and we must do something about that. And so I was able to ask the follow-on question. Does, at the end of the day, this bill do anything about that fundamental framing, this disequity in our funding formula? Does it, in fact, put a greater proportion to the special needs students? Does it, in fact, put a greater proportion to the at-risk students? Something that I will tell you, having labored in this particular policy vineyard for 11 years, that critical question of, are we willing to put a greater proportion with those at-risk students and with those special needs students, will not happen if we don't strike a grand bargain that brings the students into this conversation in a meaningful way that this bill currently does not. Anyway, this smart person who's watched this conversation gave a very honest answer that, in fact, no, this bill, 1164, will not change the proportionality, will not change the formula and make it about the students. And I will tell you the one thing that it will do, because this bill really isn't an education bill, it's a tax equity bill, it's a tax increase bill. The one thing it will do is it will raise taxes on the people of Colorado without giving them the opportunity to vote. That is, I believe, and you have all heard many times, a violation of the Constitution, a piece of the Constitution known as the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. So that's why this bill is saying we need to go to the Supreme Court and seek an answer. You will hear, or you have heard, that it's been an error. In fact, it has not been an error. There's an interpretation that was taken to provide funding the way the funding has been provided low these many years. In fact, if you read into the resolution that is a companion, a necessary companion to this bill, 1164, the resolution itself says, whereas in Mesa County, a Colorado Supreme Court decision, the Colorado Supreme Court implied that CDE acted without authority in mandating. So there is a question at large. Question needs to be answered. With that element, I agree. The reason I oppose the bill, to close out my argument, is I believe that to advance this without first advancing a meaningful conversation that makes the funding formula about students with special needs, students who arrive on our doorsteps from intergenerational poverty, students who come from communities that may need a little bit more support to get on the next step of the ladder. Until we do that, until we make that grand bargain to change the formula and make it about students, to provide additional funding through a tax increase, and we all know dollars are fungible. If we get a tax increase here, money will move to special pet projects elsewhere. It won't stay necessarily on target the way it needs to. To do that would relieve pressure on this critically important issue. That is, do we really want to make the funding formula of K-12 education in Colorado about students, or do we want it to continue to prop up a system? So thank you for listening to my comments. As the sponsors of the bill and the majority leader said, this, in fact, is a simple bill with an underlying complex subject. I call you to engage in the complexity of this, to deal with the fact that there are big strategic forces at play. And I fear that should this bill advance without greater attention, we will not do the job we should be doing on behalf of the students of Colorado. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Lundin. Mr. Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Definitely echo the comments of my good friend from Monument, the ranking member on education. Having served on House Education for 4 years and Senate Ed for 2, I too recognize that this is a complex subject, a complicated subject here in Colorado. Having talked with constituents about a variety of education issues over the years, very often it ties back to states are different. And when people move to this state from another state, things are very different, and constituents sometimes are confused by that. Our Constitution since 1876 has held that local school boards are in charge of instruction in their respective districts, and though I am not a simple country lawyer with 2 law degrees, I'm just a layperson, part-time citizen legislator. My understanding of court findings, courts have held since 1876 that if a local school board has authority of instruction, that would also mean that they have the authority over budget. And if they have authority over budget, then they have authority over things like how much people who work for the district are paid. And that doesn't prevent us at all from having news reports and thousands of people of showing up at the Capitol protest for higher teacher salaries, which we do not set here in this building. Sorry to digress away from this, but this is a complicated subject. And when people move to Colorado from other states where the legislature has a more centralized role in education funding, Colorado seems very different, because it is. I will be a no vote on the bill, 1164, but I am supportive of the process that we are undertaking here today to get this bill through second reading so that this resolution that we'll probably consider in the very near future will ask the Supreme Court, what say you? That's the constitutional question that I'm interested in knowing the answer to. The idea of thorough and uniform funding occurs in a unique way here in this unique state. We put some of the funding in, generally that's called PPR, and my good friend from Monument talked about students that might qualify for one or another factor. Free and reduced lunch, English language learner, high cost living area. And I've mentioned it before, if anyone in the public or the press is interested in seeing what Legislative Council has nicknamed the Holbert spreadsheet, it talks about all 178 school districts and how much we put in and how much they collect from the federal government and the local money that doesn't come here and isn't accounted for, and then over on the right side gives a picture of the total funding for each district. And in some districts, we're close to all of it. In other districts, we might be a third of it. It varies wildly. So how could it be thorough and uniform? Welcome to unique Colorado, where not all dollars are tracked through this building. And local communities, school districts can decide to approve a bond and mill override. They can fund schools in a different way. They might have a higher population of one of those at-risk groups, and maybe the federal government puts in more funding. But at no point, in my opinion, will we have exactly the same amount of money going out per student to each district from this building, because we don't control all of the dollars in this building. Apparently, in some states, most, maybe all of the dollars for education are somehow accounted for or controlled by the state legislature, the governor. The state capital can account for all of those. But here in Colorado, it's been an exercise for legislative council to go out and actually find all of those numbers and glue them into one spreadsheet. But while I'll be a no vote on 1164 and appreciate the experience, the knowledge of our ranking member, the good senator from Monument, I also want to say thank you to the chair of Senate Education for bringing the bill, for asking the question. And I think that's what we need to do. In order to ask that question, we need to get this bill, I think, through second reading. And while I'll be a no vote, I'll be happy to reach that milestone. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity. Ask for a no vote.
Thank you, Mr. Minority Leader. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, the question before us is the adoption of House Bill 1164. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Ayes have it. The bill is adopted. Mr. Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move the committee rise and report.
The question before us is for the committee to rise and report. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, no. The mumbling of ayes have it, and the committee will rise and report.
The Senate will come to order. Mr. Panetta, please add Senator Woodward to the roll call. Senator Bridges.
Thank you, Mr. President. The committee has met and had a bill under consideration. Will the clerk please read the report?
Mr. President, the committee of the whole begs leave to report it has had under consideration the following attached bills bring the second reading thereof and makes their following recommendations thereon. House Bill 1164 passed on second reading in order revised and placed in the calendar for third reading and final passage.
Senator Bridges.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move the report.
The motion is the adoption of the committee of the whole report. Are there any no votes? With a vote of 35 ayes, 0 noes, 0 absent, and 0 excused, the committee of the whole report is adopted. House Bill 1164 passed on second reading, order revised, placed on the calendar for third reading and final passage. Introduction and consideration of resolutions. Will the clerk please read the title to SJR 006?
SJR 006 by Senator Zenzinger and Fenberg and Representative Escar and Garnett concerning a request of the Supreme Court of the State of Colorado to render its opinion upon a question regarding House Bill 21-1164.
Mr. Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of Senate Joint Resolution 006.
Is there any discussion? Senator Zenzinger.
Thank you, Mr. President. So this morning, we passed on second reading House Bill 1164. It was a long time ago, I know. And that bill forms the basis of a constitutional question to be sent to the Colorado Supreme Court as an interrogatory, and we hope that that interrogatory and their decision will help correct a longstanding error in our property tax system that funds school finance. Now, the resolution before you, and I hope you've had an opportunity to read it, lays out very clearly our case for why we believe that school district total program mill levy reductions that occurred through the 90s and early 2000s violated state statute. and the underlying assumption that the General Assembly may correct this error by requiring districts to reset their mill levies to the levels at which they would have been but for the unauthorized reductions, without requiring a school district to obtain additional voter approval. It submits the following question to the Supreme Court. Can the General Assembly, by statute, correct the unauthorized reductions in school district total program levies by requiring impacted school districts to reset their mill levies to the levels at which the levies would have been, but for the unauthorized reductions that occurred after the school districts obtained voter approval to retain excess property tax revenue, and then requiring school districts to gradually remove the temporary property tax credits as provided in House Bill 1164 without obtaining prior voter approval? I ask for an aye vote because don't we want to know? Don't we want to know the answer to this question? I feel that it's appropriate that we get some sort of backing, some sort of approval to move forward in this way. And that's exactly what we're asking for, is to please weigh in and let us know whether this is correct or not. So with that, I very much ask for your approval of this resolution, and thank you very much.
Is there further discussion? Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. President, colleagues. I did not have an opportunity to prepare an extensive legal discussion concerning this resolution, which is an interrogatory, in essence, a question to the Supreme Court about the constitutionality of the bill that was just passed on second reading, 1164. Now, it is important that each of us understand what we are doing. Every day we pass bills here. We send them on to the other chamber, or if we're the second chamber, and we don't amend it and send it back and forth a few times, call a conference committee and all that sort of thing. We send it to the first floor, and if the governor's home, he will sign it or veto it, at which point it becomes the law of the state of Colorado, and it's presumed to be constitutional. That's what law and precedent says about the things that we do, that they are presumed to be constitutional. Doesn't mean they are. That's just where the court starts. And then these laws sort of await application, and it is the role of the courts, as these laws that we pass and the governor signs into law get applied, that some aggrieved party may well bring a case before the Supreme Court. Now, at the federal level, you don't get to ask the Supreme Court of the United States about a federal law. They don't have this interrogatory process. And I have wondered from time to time, although there have been more interrogatories of recent than there were historically, whether this is a good process or not. I mean, what it is we are asking the state Supreme Court to exercise their jurisdiction under Article 6, Section 3 of our Constitution. And I suspect that only a handful of you whipped out Article 6, Section 3 to take a look at it today or yesterday, or to look at the cases around it. We can certainly ask sort of a letter to the court, a long letter, by the way, written by lawyers. But it is, in the first instance, our responsibility to decide, as we vote for a law, whether or not it's constitutional. And there are different attitudes about this in this chamber and in the General Assembly and over time. I've heard some of you say, well, we're going to pass it and we'll see what the court says. Some of us have said, I am not going to vote for it because I believe it to be unconstitutional. That would be my own position about House Bill 1164. Are we justified in asking the court, and will they answer? You know, I won't get to argue whether or not they should answer. But bear with me. Since I haven't had an opportunity to sort of gather the research about this, you're stuck with flipping to the Constitution and seeing what the cases kind of by the head note say. And, you know, I see here a case from 1952, which is precedent. It is guidance to the court by a prior court of an interrogatory from the governor. And by the way, the governor can propound these. And I recall that when Amendment 41 was passed, there were interrogatories propounded by Governor Ritter about the interpretation of Amendment 41. But you know, this holding is kind of instructive. It says in order to, and it involved the court saying, you ask, we're not answering. And they're not obligated to answer. They are, I think they would say, obligated to determine whether it's appropriate to answer, and if so, then answer. The court at that time noted that the thing about which the governor had asked or propounded an interrogatory to the court, the question asked, they say the court would be obliged to construe at least 3 sections of the Constitution, at least 4 sections of statutes. It appeared that there was a conflict between the specified constitutional provisions themselves, as well as the constitutional and statutory provisions, and a possible conflict between the statutory provisions, presenting a most difficult problem of constitutional and statutory construction, requiring exhaustive research and most careful consideration. The questions propounded might all be the subject of litigation in which the parties to be affected will be afforded ample opportunity of presenting their causes, and then, and not until then, would it be the court's duty on requested review to give these important constitutional and statutory questions its exhaustive research and study. They declined. In a 1955 case, for legal questions propounded by the Senate, they indicated that the court should not prejudge involved legal problems and fundamental constitutional interpretations and ex parte proceedings. Basically, where you don't have a party arguing a case, bringing a specific problem, and another party saying, not so, and defending the opposite position. They say it's the policy of the Supreme Court to accommodate, and this would be an accommodation by the court, accommodate the General Assembly only in such cases as are clear and where no prejudice result to anyone in the future. As a general proposition, the court doubts the wisdom of prejudging involved in complex legal problems and fundamental constitutional questions in proceedings under this section. The constitutional directive cannot be taken to mean that the Supreme Court should so act when possible prejudice may well result later to citizens whose rights are protected by both the state and federal constitution. Again, just taking a quick look at these things, the court seems to have said all those years ago, good precedent today. If the court were to respond to interrogatories propounded with respect to the validity of a proposed statute, to the effect that such legislation is in all respects constitutional, because that's what we're going to ask, such holding would be prejudicial to any citizen who at a future date might question its validity in the Supreme Court. Now, what has that got to do with 1164? Because you say, well, if we pass this, it's going to be all of these things. Well, our resolution, it says, you know, you get over to page 4 after you get the lengthy history of how we got here, and as discussed by my colleague from Monument. And by the way, if you can juggle all those taxation procedure balls in the air and hold them there for longer than about 5 minutes, you are better than I, but I am a simple country lawyer, so never practiced on 17th Street or K Street or any of those things. But we go on for pages and pages, and then we say, the fact that in implementing the correction of its total program mill levy by reducing the temporary property tax credit in accordance with the correction schedule, that's in 1164, a school district is assessing a, quote, and this, quote, a mill levy above that for the prior year, which normally requires voter approval under Article 10, Section 20, Sub 4 of Tabor. In other words, the Tabor Act normally requires voter approval under Tabor. So what are we doing here? Well, we're telling the court, well, normally this requires approval of the voters. But we think maybe we don't need the approval of the voters now. We want the court to give us permission to not get approval of the voters. That's really what we're asking here. Court, give me permission and tell me it'll be okay. We go on with our whereases. Lawyers love whereases. The issues raised by 1164 are strictly legal issues. Well, that has been the case in all of these interrogatories for the most part. They don't seem to be factual issues. It says, no factual issues are likely to arise in the context of a private suit that would enhance the Colorado Supreme Court's ability to adjudicate these issues. That's an assertion by us. I would urge the court, don't take that at face value. Don't take this resolution and what the General Assembly asserts at face value, because I think there are factual issues likely to arise in the context of a private suit. Like, how is it that CDE did this thing? And why did CDE do that? There are factual issues. So, why do we have to have an answer before we pass this or reject it? Because some of us believe, by the way, reject it, because some of us believe that raising a mill levy above that for the prior year requires voter approval under Tabor. And somebody might walk up to me and go, well, Bob, how can you say that? And I'd say, because I think that's what Tabor says. Let's go look. I mean, I'm not just making up my position on that matter. I'm not just dreaming it up or pulling it out of thin air or someplace else. We've already said in our own resolution, assessing a mill levy above that for the prior year under Tabor requires voter approval. But, court, tell us it's okay otherwise so we can go ahead. And they might, I don't know. On a 4-3 vote, they might. But I think there's some important factual issues here. And I wonder who's going to stipulate to those factual issues about how CDE got where it was, how we got here, why the decisions were made that were made. Now, we want the court to bail us out. That's what we're asking. Don't make us make hard decisions here. Let's surrender our authority to the court. Because the state, meaning really the General Assembly, and school districts will lack certainty as to the appropriate level of school districts' total program mill levies and the concomitant level of state funding required for public education. Well, I think that decision can be made. It's like, will it be constitutional? Well, we do that every day here. We have to do that every day. And we do it on bigger things than balancing the books, quite ironically. We do it on people's individual rights. Seen it time after time where people have said, well, when I've been to the well, both in this chamber and our sister chamber, and said, I don't think this is constitutional. And someone has come to the well and said, well, if it's not, the court will tell us that, but we think it's a good idea right now. Well, if you think it's a good idea, then vote for it. Because they want to be spared the risk of cost and delays of legal action and the imposition of substantial refund obligations. Well, You can drop that money into reserve. I do think the court, once this becomes ripe, a legal term for when an issue is actually joined, when there is actually a law and the law is actually applied, when it becomes ripe, I think there will be plenty of people, 178 school districts probably together. They'll probably do it through the Colorado Association of School Boards or some other group on behalf of all the districts, and they'll all pony up the money, and we'll have 17th Street lawyers. I was in the court a year or so ago when people could go without mask, and there was a tax issue there, and I'd gone over because I had to, I had the privilege of arguing a less momentous case, more obscure, a few days later, and I just kind of wanted to go over and watch and get acclimated once again, and the whole place was full. It was on a, as I recall, perhaps a sales tax issue, but there were significant dollars. I've never seen a courtroom so full in my life. They were sitting in each other's laps before mask. When I went a few weeks later for my case, there were the lawyers and about 3 people sitting in the back beside staff. So I don't think that, given what's at stake here, that this is some extraordinary obligation. Says individual lawsuits brought against multiple school districts by taxpayers who are required to pay more on school district property taxes, et cetera, et cetera. The many potential lawsuits could result in a confusing patchwork of inconsistent district court decisions. Well, that happens. But I suspect once this is joined and once there is a case, I suspect they're going to happen really quickly. Or maybe this bill really won't pass. Maybe the governor will get worried about it. Maybe the governor will think it's unconstitutional. I don't know. I mean, that is interesting, isn't it? We have presumed in our resolution that if it passes in this chamber, if 1164 passes in this chamber, that the governor's just ready to go. Maybe so, probably so. That assumes and presumes a lot of things about this process that strike me as not very comforting. We make this conclusion that House Bill 1164 will likely pass the Senate on 3rd reading because we did it on 2nd reading. It'll likely pass on 3rd reading, paren, because we counted our votes, close paren, and be signed into law by the governor, paren, because we asked him and he said, oh yeah, I'm going to sign it, close paren. Why don't we just submit interrogatories at the beginning? Why don't we submit interrogatories before every bill and just ask the court? I suppose they could refuse all of mine, but for those majority bills that have constitutional implications, why not just ask? Well, because the court does not exercise its interrogatory jurisdiction, its original jurisdiction, to take these interrogatories lightly. Should not do so. And the General Assembly ought to, the General Assembly, which is bound, each of us by our oath, to follow the Constitution of the state of Colorado and the United States, but in this case, the one we speak of is the Constitution of the state of Colorado. You know, we have to decide in the first instance whether something's constitutional. We do. Now, maybe many of you don't think about that at all. It's always in the back of my mind. Hope it is in the back of yours. I would hope that it is in the back of yours. And sometimes it comes to the forefront, and it's in the forefront in this case. But really what we're asking, what you're asking, is for the court to take you off the hook. Take me off the hook. I don't have to make a tough decision about the constitutionality of this. I want to do this really badly. I want to do this really badly, but I'm not really certain I can. I think SJR 6 is ill-advised, and that the General Assembly ought to do its job. That each of us ought to decide. When the President says, are there any no votes, we ought to decide, not only is it a policy that I want to support, maybe it is, as some have argued, many, that somehow we have gotten into a box here. And maybe we have. Maybe Tabor puts you in a box. It wouldn't be the first time that a constitutional provision put one into a box. Constitutional provisions about all sorts of things that put people in a box. Provisions about also whether you read things or not. Kind of become a restriction. Members, when the third reading vote is called, you ought to make the decision about constitutionality. And you know, far be it for me to tell the court or argue to the court about whether they should respond to this interrogatory, that is, to answer the interrogatory or decline to do so. There are a lot of complex issues here. It isn't that simple. How we got here, the application of Tabor, how it works, how CDE got in the box that it is, that somehow a school district would end up assessing a mill levy above that for the prior year, which normally requires voter approval, but we somehow with a straight face can say it doesn't. I think that's for a case involving a plaintiff and a defendant. There will be more than one, but I imagine those cases will be consolidated, put together. The appellate process will be, I don't think we'll have to suffer through a court of appeals. Argument and decision, because everyone will ask the court at that point to go ahead and take the case directly, and they can do that. Those of you who have been involved in litigation in the Supreme Court recently will know that to be the case. And they can make the decision. And they can put it on their docket wherever they wish. And I think they would find this to be an important case. But it ought to be fully briefed. It ought to be fully briefed by the proponents of House Bill 1164 and representatives of the citizens who believe that it should go to a vote of the people. I ask for a no vote on SJR 006.
Senator Lundin.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Colleagues, we debated 1164 briefly before. We're now looking at this companion piece. Before I argued, 1164 stood in the way of getting students where we need to provide the financing to get them. Consider it this way, a word picture, a bridge we need to build, or a bridge that might even exist if we would just choose to execute upon it. That bridge would give an increased proportional amount of money to special needs students. 1164 in this companion resolution, take a plank off of that bridge and throw it in the river to float away. That bridge would provide a pathway for at-risk students to move from here to a better future. 1164 in this resolution, take another plank off that bridge and throw it in the river and it floats downstream. Students who live in a space of sparsity, the rural environment of Colorado. I mean, most of the political clout, let's be frank, in this building comes from the metro area. But most of the geography, quite frankly, I would argue a lot of the ethos, the definition of who we are as a state, is in our rural communities. Students in sparsity perhaps deserve a proportional representation of additional dollars. 1164 gets in the way of that. Take another bridge or plank off the bridge, throw it in the river, and let it float downstream. Children that come from intergenerational poverty perhaps need a proportional increase. 1164 and this resolution stand in the way of that. Take another plank off that bridge, throw it in the river, and let it float downstream. Students that are learning English as a second language so that this can be their home where they deserve to have the opportunities we all deserve to have. They deserve perhaps proportional additional dollars. 1164 and this resolution stand in the way of that. Take another plank off the bridge, throw it in the river. There are not many planks left on the bridge at this point. The reality is, this is an effort where the ideal about making the financing of education about students and not about systems and adults, founders. The argument is, just give us more money. You know what you do if you just give us more money? The money goes to the places it already goes, in the proportions it already goes. We need to correct and make the system about the students. 1164 and this resolution stand in the way. You heard from the previous speaker, the simple country attorney from Colorado Springs, that this is a long letter written by lawyers to the Supreme Court. And I will say, it's a long letter with a question to which I object. You read through pages 2, 3, 4, 5. You get to 6 and we finally get to the question. Well, the question's framed up in an oddball way. It's all prejudicial. It loads all these assumptions in that I would say are not correct. Given that most school districts obtain voter approval to retain excess property tax revenue, but were required without legal authority, that's the question. If you're looking for an honest answer, you don't go in saying that was illegal. I think that's false. That's a false premise. It's leading. It's incorrect. The question goes on. It continues. Can the General Assembly, having already mandated that those school districts reset their total program mill levies? You remember I stood in this well and kind of stamped my feet last year at the end of the session or near the end of the session as we were doing the School Finance Act. And I said, there is a Trojan horse in this bill? Well, here's your Trojan horse. It just showed back up. And the soldiers who want to take those planks off the bridge that would get students from the challenged circumstance they find themselves in today to a better tomorrow, those soldiers just throwing those planks in the river. They're crawling out of that Trojan horse, having already mandated that those school districts reset their total program mills. We were told at that time, don't worry, there's tax credits that offset this Trojan horse. Nobody's going to have a tax increase. We've got these tax credits in place, net zero, no harm, no foul. Colleagues, the harm and the foul are happening right here in the way we're asking this question. Now, here's the crux of the whole thing. I'm not an attorney, although I did for 4 years play one on radio in the Colorado House Judiciary Committee. But I do have a role in this process. You have a role in this process. We all have a role in this process. The crux question here, and I want to be clear, this is about establishing legislative intent. We don't get to argue before the court, but I'm certainly willing to stand here and say, as for this legislator, to this crux question of tax increase without obtaining voter approval, my legislative intent is clear: no, no, no. There are factual issues that need to be litigated. That's part of what we're shirking our responsibility on. And I'm not going to talk to this side of the aisle on this issue. I'm going to talk to this side of the aisle. The reality is, taxpayers are really clear on the taxpayer Bill of Rights. They like it. They, in fact, pay attention to it. They, in the last election, passed a proposition that says, don't you dare create another one of those enterprise things without coming to me if it raises X number of dollars. They're very clear about their role in protecting their pocketbooks. This resolution says, we're just going to hide that question. We're going to pretend that question doesn't exist. We're going to wink at the taxpayer Bill of Rights. Those are some interesting chickens that may come home to roost. I think that we should not shirk our responsibility on acknowledging and defending that. And that's what this resolution essentially does. It says, let's wink at this idea of voter approval of tax increases. I object to the resolution, which is part of a tax policy question, but I object to it on behalf of the students of Colorado who come from a circumstance different than my children came from, who maybe need a little bit of extra support, who need our public education system to say, you know what, we're going to take you exactly as you show up at the school, and we're going to acknowledge the challenges that may come with you in a way that we haven't previously in our funding formula, because that's the proper thing to do. That's the way it should be done. I argue with incredible passion, as you might have understood, on this issue, because I've fought for 11 years on this issue, 4 years in the State Board of Education, 4 years in the House, 3 years now here. The reality is, sure, absolutely, this would raise taxes, put some more money in the system, and I ask, but what system? I would argue it stands before us, defending itself as a system. About adults, we need to change it and make it more completely meaningfully about students. And the only way to do that is to change the way funding flows. Because finance is policy, and our policy today does not support students in a way it should. Mr. President, thank you for the opportunity to speak to this. I oppose SJR 21006. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Bridges.
Thank you, Mr. President. And to my good friend, the senator from Monument, I agree completely that it is time that we change the funding formula. We have an inequitable funding formula in the state. We need to make sure that the kids who need the most support get the most support. The formula we have doesn't do that. Where we disagree is that I believe this change, making the revenue model more equitable, will allow us to make the funding formula more equitable as well. I urge an aye vote.
Senator Zenzinger.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Excuse me,
and
Senator,
thank
Senator
you
Zenzinger.
to-
I'm sorry, my apologies. Mr. Panetta, please mark Senator Danielson excused, Senator Buckner excused, and Senator Woodward excused. Senator Zenzinger.
Thank you, Mr. President. I very much appreciate the comments that were raised today. I think it's been an excellent discussion. I had a couple of people ask me, how long have we been working on this? And it's true. This has been a very long journey. And so just, I want to very briefly kind of chronicle some of the steps that brought us to this point, because I think this point is a very important point in this pathway. So as you all know, Tabor imposed a cap on tax revenue that would not allow school district revenues to grow at a faster rate than inflation plus enrollment growth. So after Tabor's passage, if local property tax revenues were going to exceed the Tabor cap, it's about exceeding the cap because of increases in property values, then the mill levy would be reduced in order to keep those local revenues within that cap. Between 1994 and 2002, voters in 174 of the 178, so all but four districts in Colorado they voted, the taxpayers voted to permanently waive Tabor's revenue limitations. This is called debrucing. So despite those successful debrucing elections, where the voters got to decide this, CDE acted as if these elections had not occurred when calculating their local share for school finance. And this is a really important part because voters don't get to decide this calculation. This is in statute. CDE calculates it, and it's based on statute. So voters have no control of this, and districts had no control over this. So despite these successful elections, CDE acted as if these elections had not occurred when calculating their local share as it is calculated within school finance, which required school districts to reduce their mill levies to remain under Tabor's revenue limits, even though these communities were no longer subject to those limits. These mill levy reductions compounded over time. In 1993, when Tabor first took effect, school district mill levies averaged 38 mills. That was the average. So the reductions required by CDE after successful debrucing elections dropped the average school district mill levy to 19 mills, which is where we are today. That's the average, meaning we have districts that are well below, districts that are well above, average. So recognizing that these ongoing reductions were inequitable and quite frankly unsustainable, the General Assembly, the legislative body, back in 2007, passed legislation that froze those mill levies for debruced districts, locking in that patchwork of mill levies in place ever since. So that was actions that were taken back in 2007. The good senator from Colorado Springs actually voted no on that bill. I looked it up. So he is being consistent with his values. And after that School Finance Act passed in 2007, it was challenged. So the General Assembly's action was challenged. So it went to court. Then it was appealed. And in that appeal, the Supreme Court found, and I'm quoting here from their finding, we conclude that the General Assembly was acting within constitutional limits when it amended the School Finance Act, because that's the piece that we are debating here today. the legislature amended the School Finance Act and froze in place in 2007 the patchwork of mill levy districts that we had. Quote, SB 07-199's treatment of the school districts as the relevant taxing authorities for purposes of waiving the revenue limits is consistent with the constitutional provisions governing dual state/local funding and the constitutional provisions applicable to public education. Interpreting Article 10, Section 20, also known as TABOR, interpreting this section's various provisions harmoniously leads to the conclusion that only one election at the school district level was required in this case, and the local school district elections fulfilled that election requirement. There is ample evidence to find that SB 07-199 constitutional, and we find the plaintiffs failed to show that it violated any constitutional provision of Article 10, Section 20. So yes, we have some agreement, good cases on both sides, and so that's why this step today is significant, because it's putting us on the pathway to answering the question. By moving us forward today, as these mills declined, the state, us, our budget, was on the hook for a growing share of these K-12 costs. With most of the backfill, by the way, going to the wealthiest, fastest growing districts. And once these mills went down, they could never go back up. And we, the General Assembly, has had to backfill them. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about this bill today. I appreciate the opportunity to encourage your vote on this resolution, to please allow this question to continue forward to what I believe is very near the end of its journey. And I ask for an aye vote.
Further discussion? Seeing none, the motion before the body is the passage of SJR 006. Are there any no votes? Senators Lundin, Gardner, the Minority Leader, Cook, Scott, Simpson, Liston, Sonnenberg, Heisey, Kirkmeyer, Smallwood. Quorum. With a vote of 20 ayes, 12 no votes, 0 absent, and 3 excused, SJR 006 is passed. Co-sponsors. Senators Lee, Pedersen, Hawkes Lewis, Kolker, Story, Moreno, Janal, Hanson, Gonzalez, Fields, Bridges, Coleman. Announcements. Senator Donovan.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I request a moment of personal privilege?
Granted.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I wanted to take a moment, even though it is Friday, to just talk about an issue while it's kind of in the media and being discussed, and that is the proposed perimeter Capitol fencing. What I would like to raise is the importance of symbolism and perception on this issue. If we go, Minority Leader, I'm going to be channeling you a lot in this moment. If we go back to our Declaration of Independence, even in those earliest moments of us considering how our country would be perceived, we had this disagreement of where the seat of government could and should be. And we said, one of our complaints was that we shouldn't just be able to move around the seat of government willy-nilly, that was not something that our country believed was a good way to do government. We said there should be a place of government, and that place has significance and symbolism. I think we have to, with that in mind, we need to be particularly aware of doing things with our capital. And no matter the largeness of where those recommendations are coming from, we should not just simply do recommendations without thinking of what those recommendations could mean. Now, I think also it is important to state where we are in this process. We are very early in this process of a proposal. Some of the commentary that has been on social media, letters, emails, have perceived this as an approved wall being built around the Capitol. Not accurate. It is being proposed as fencing in the 4 quadrants, and even through further discussions, that is in the earliest of design phases, and that fencing, even as considered now, in the very preliminary stages of a multi-step approval process, would have egress and access. We're not going to fence off the Armenian Genocide Memorial. That being said, it is still critical, and that's why I wanted to raise my voice early today, as we were at the beginning of this process, of what the symbolism is of erecting a fence, even with gates, around portions of our state's capital. In the 1860s, when we were thinking of creating this weird square state in the middle of the country, it didn't make sense, right? I mean, this state was settlers nestled at the base of the mountains in mining camps. Denver was a tent city. We had strong Hispanic roots along the southern border, the east and the west. We had Native American tribes, but we drew this geometric shape in the middle of the country. The Capitol became a really important aspect to be erected at, then it was going to be the highest building in our capital city, not so much anymore, on Browns Bluff. And it was supposed to be a physical representation of our collective identity of the state. Now, of course, it was an imperfect collective identity because things are often done imperfectly at a moment in history and then reflected upon, but it was the best attempt at that time to be a collective representation of this somewhat inorganic construction of a state that we were then going to name Colorado. And over the centuries, it's been a stage for moments of Colorado's history. I think we all know the picture of the state, of the Capitol, with those huge pennants, red, white, and blue, I would imagine, hung. Thousands upon thousands of people gathered on the steps and the surrounding areas. That was in 1899 as we welcomed troops back from the Spanish-American War. A perhaps more lighthearted one, but a picture that the minority leader and I have both had the privilege of having in our Capitol offices is the Super Bowl celebration, where I will forever connect the Capitol being just swarmed with orange as just a wonderful moment of Colorado's history of joyfulness. It also has been a moment of protest. Most recently, during the Black Lives Matter movements, this place equally became a point for our citizens to express not this time celebration, but concern. And it belongs to, and this is a quote that was written when people were trying to raise money for the redoing this chamber, redoing the Golden Dome. It belongs to every citizen equally as the seat of civil authority. I want all of these things to come together and remind us of what this place is. I mean, it's filled with the pride of every citizen of Colorado, and it should remain as a physical representation of an accessible seat of our government. Even the floors, it is not the governor's building. It is not the legislator's building. We share this. It is the public's building, and it is filled with symbols of our state. When it was originally built, it was meant to express what Colorado could be, a fledgling state unknown. And so we filled it with things to express what we could be. These lovely columns here that you think might be plaster, those are from Pueblo. They were constructed down there to show just the remarkable abilities of our steelworkers in Pueblo. We all know the gorgeous stone that bedazzles most of the building, that we found that in Colorado, dug it to extinction to bring it here. The marble on most of our floors is from my district. It's a marble from marble, clever enough. I always joke that I never leave district because I'm always walking on marble. Even our doorknobs have columbines. We were so proud of what we could be, and we wanted that reflected in this building. Its existence as a public building is its definition. And nothing can more aptly symbolize our ever-changing state than a building that continues to be a venue for those changes. The story of the Capitol is the story of the people of Colorado. And as this process evolves over the coming months, I ask that the gravity of symbolism perhaps outweigh the process of recommendations. That as we balance this scale of symbolism versus convenience, let's remember this is no ordinary building. Thank you, Mr. President and colleagues. I do appreciate your time on a Friday.
Mr. Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ask for a moment of personal privilege.
Granted.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think I agree with most of what the President Pro Tem offered. I also wanted to address some of the emails, the contacts I've received about the fence. And my encouragement to people is, do you know what it would look like? Because I think, I'm not sure what it would look like, but I think I have a fairly good idea of what's being proposed. And my response is, not all fences are created equal. If it were, for instance, I don't know for sure, but if it were a low rock or block wall with a decorative low cast iron, wrought iron sort of fence above it, that might help defend this building against things like, gosh, the Oklahoma City scenario. and keeping vehicles that might have less than positive interests in being close to the Capitol, away from the Capitol, might that be a good thing? Yeah, I think it might be. But if a person has in his or her head the idea of a fence of something that's 6 or 8 feet high and chain link with barbed wire on top, I'm fairly confident that isn't being contemplated here. And if the fence concept might be envisioned as something that would encircle the Capitol, it's not that either. It would be the 4 corners in between the 4 main staircases located north, south, east, and west. And I think if we were to look at, some of the buildings in Washington, D.C., where landscape features have been added around buildings to maybe complement the design, the appearance, or to add to security that maybe in the past wasn't contemplated, that some of those design features, that landscaping, might actually be seen as complementary to the overall design, and in some cases, beautiful. So I share my good friend from Vail, her concerns about limiting access to the people to their capital. I've never support that. Just ask those who have heard about this thing called a fence. If you haven't seen a design concept, if that's not available yet, if that hasn't been agreed upon, just encourage maybe some hesitation, some waiting until that design is available and you can see for yourself what is or is not being contemplated. The reason I have confidence in encouraging this perspective is those decisions would first be made by the Capitol Building Advisory Committee. And I want to say thank you to the people, Madam Secretary, yourself included, I believe, who served there. If we look around at the beauty of this chamber, and the President Pro Tem pointed out some of the aspects, this restoration was started and managed by them. The state architect, whose job it is to defend, protect, restore, make this place continually beautiful. They're charged with adding design elements and maintaining this building according to statute to maintain its integrity. The beauty that the people of Colorado gave us that we see here today. Would they approve something that would detract from the design elements, the beauty of this building, in direct contradiction to their statutory charge? I think the answer is no. So for the people of Colorado, we hear you, we hear your concerns. My encouragement, if you are concerned about a fence, please take time to see what it would look like, maybe understand what it is, what it isn't. I'm not sure that those designs are to a place where they're completed enough for them to be published. But I join my friend from Vail in just expressing concern about limiting access to people, but I have confidence in the Capitol Building Advisory Committee, the State Patrol, those who are charged with protecting people and property here at the Capitol Complex. I don't know of anything that would actually deter the access for people of Colorado to their capital. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Moreno.
Thank you, Mr. President. I request a moment of personal privilege.
Granted.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I won't belabor this discussion much. I just wanted to offer a perspective. It's weird. I don't think the senator from Vail or the senator from Douglas County were saying anything different. I think, both opinions are important. I have the great honor of serving on the Capitol Building Advisory Committee. It is one of my favorite committee assignments because I care about this building so much. Not just from a historical perspective, for what it stands for. It is an institution of our democracy. It is where we exchange ideas, where we have dialogue, where we invite members of the public to weigh in on issues that will ultimately affect them. I think this issue is probably the most attention that the Capitol Building Advisory Committee has ever received on any issue. But I just want to emphasize, colleagues, that none of this is being considered lightly. Ensuring that public access will always be at the heart of the decisions that are made by that committee or any other that is involved in approval, because it is many committees. It may start with the Capitol Building Advisory Committee, but it is also through the Capital Development Committee. It is also through the Executive Committee. There are many, many stages of approval that any change to our Capitol goes through. So I encourage and I look forward to more discussions on this topic. Clearly, all of us have feelings and opinions on this issue because we are all affected by it. We are all elected members of the General Assembly. We all want to make sure that the public's access to this building is protected. That should always remain at the forefront of any of our decisions. I would invite my colleagues to express your thoughts, opinions to me, because as your representative on the Capitol Building Advisory Committee, I can represent those through the process. But I want to emphasize that something from the senator from Vail said earlier. It is early in this process. It is design. There is not any plan to put up a fence in any near future. It is design work that came from security recommendations to try to prevent the type of damage that the Capitol experienced over the summer. This is a historical building, but it stands for so much more than that. And we should do everything we can to ensure that it is protected and that it serves that role as a place to convene for both the public and for the exchange of ideas in our democracy. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Fields.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to request a moment of personal privilege.
Granted.
I would like to just advance and to continue the conversations that we've had as it relates to protecting the state capitol and the thoughts and ideas that are emerging as relates to fencing. I sit on the Capital Development Committee. I was chair last year, and so there's been a lot of discussion about this topic. But I can tell you that this is the people's house. And the people's house has to be accessible to our school kids who come down here on field trips. It has to be accessible to people who want to come down here to testify on legislation that is being proposed. It can't be anything like a prison. It can't be anything that has fencing like you might see at the Denver Mint or other kinds of armed type facilities. It has been presented to our committee, the Capital Development Committee, some thoughts and ideas, but we have not seen any concrete designs at this point. So it's a little premature to say that it's just going to have these barbed wires on the top and spikes and, you're going to have to come in with, it's too premature. And I have the utmost confidence that the people who are going to make these recommendations are going to do so very thoughtfully as relates to maybe trends that we're seeing across the United States. But it's going to be done in a manner that is reflective of the values of Colorado. We are all very unique here in the Senate because only us can occupy these desks and these seats during this time. We have the sergeants that are protecting us. We have the folks behind us that are managing protocol. We have people who buff and shine and maintain this building every single day. There's a lot of pride that goes into this building, into this facilities, into its grounds. So when the time comes, we'll all have an opportunity to have input on what that looks like. But I can tell you, as for me and my district, and me being a citizen of Colorado, I'm going to make sure that it reflects the beauty of the state of Colorado. And so be patient, make sure that you elevate and advance your concerns in reference to what it might look like. But I don't think it'll ever look like a big fence with barbed wire on top that limits access to the people's house. We're here because the people sent us. People come down here to protest. What are we going to do? Cut off the West Capitol steps where people cannot no longer convene to express their concerns on a variety of different issues. That's not the American way. It's not the Colorado way. We will still have great access to this building. I don't know what it's going to look like yet, but I know that people are thinking about it. And then we'll have opportunity to weigh in on their designs and their ideas. Thank you, Mr. President, for this opportunity to share my concerns about this great facility that we all have the honor to serve in. Thank you.
Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. President. I request a moment of personal privilege.
Granted.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I'm looking around the chamber. The senator from Sterling, my colleague and friend from the senator from Colorado Springs, and I, perhaps a minority leader working in the building, will remember when one could walk into the Capitol, walk right to our office, if you could find it, go to the bullpen that it used to exist, the room formerly known as 271, ask where to find Representative Gardner, because I didn't call myself the senator from Colorado Springs in those days, and say, hey, Bob, I was in Denver and I wanted to come and see you, or I came to Denver to see you, but they did. And then after what was my first session, there was a terrible incident on the first floor, an attempt on the life of Governor Ritter by someone who had mental health problems. And then we had a big debate. Should we have metal detectors? And I come down today to speak about this because I didn't speak about it then. I sat there, and as hard as that may be for you to believe, I sat there and I really was torn. There were those who came down and made emotional pleas about their own safety and security, and I get it. It's not something that, while I worry about my surroundings, or I'm try to be conscious of my surroundings, it's not something that I sort of, by personality, give a lot of thought to. But I understand those who do and why they do. Others who argued that we didn't have metal detectors before, and we probably didn't need them, but there weren't many voices. Today, you can't get into the building without, unless you're a member or an employee, without going through that metal detector, and it's a barrier between my constituents and me. It's a little harder to get into the building. It's harder. And we lost something. We really did lose something. Now, was it necessary? I look at events that have happened since 2007, and I wonder how those things would have unfolded had we not had controlled access into the building in the way that we do. It was controlled in those days. There were particular entrances that the public could use, but you didn't have to say, "Mother, may I?" And by the way, a couple of years ago, I had occasion to visit the Capitol in Alaska, and they were doing extensive work on the front of the building, and we went into the building, and the entrance was around here, and kind of went through a door, and I'm looking for the metal detector, and there was a state, I think a state trooper sitting there, and I said, "Is this the way to get in?" And he goes, "Yes, welcome to our Capitol. Go on in." And I remembered when it used to be that way here and what was lost, because it was a very different feel to the building. But it is, after all, Alaska. And by the way, the lobbyist, the gallery is right down on the floor. You can almost reach across. For those of you who have ever been there, you could reach across and hand a card to a member right there, which is forbidden by the rules. I wonder how they got to control that pretty carefully. All of this, I appreciate your indulgence, Mr. President. All of that to say, this fence debate is important. I don't know what the answer is, but I do know, no matter how beautiful it might be and how wonderful it might be, we will, if we put up any kind of further barrier around this building, we will pay a price. It will separate us a little bit more from our constituents in a way that is hard to quantify, and maybe it will have to be, because as I say, for the longest time I thought we really made a bad decision about metal detectors. I mean, we got some security, but don't know if we got that much more. And then as time has gone on, and I think the world in some sense has changed, it's become clear to me that in the past few years that would have been incredibly difficult. So, members, I can't decide for anyone how they ought to come down on this decision. Just recognize that each of these things comes at a cost of separating us from our constituents. Frankly, moving us across to the services building for our offices over there and out of this building is a cost, because my constituents think I must have an office here. Occasionally they say, "Oh, it's like Washington. You got an office building over there. It's like Washington." I don't want to be like Washington. I long for the days, and I guess you get to a certain age, you long for a lot of days. I long for the days that constituents, even some of them I'd rather hadn't found me, could walk right up, stick their head around the door, stick their head around the cubicle, and the bullpen and say, hey, how are you? Because most of the time it was a delightful surprise. Delightful surprise, because as much as I love all of you and everyone in the lobby, after about a day 100, it got pretty old, and just to see anyone from Colorado Springs was a treat. So let's be thoughtful about this, let's be careful about this, and let's understand that there will be trade-offs and there will be things that will be lost. We may gain protection, we gain security. One certainly hopes that that's where we go, but we will lose a certain amount of connection with our communities. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Priola.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. I want to speak about this for a bit, but I'll start it with the fact
But the
that...
good senator requests permission to...
Sorry, Mr. President. Mr. President, I request a moment of personal privilege.
Granted.
Thank you. I want to speak a bit about this issue. I'll start off by saying I don't have the answer. It's going to be a difficult and complex discussion and negotiation, but I'll give a little background about things I've experienced and maybe some feedback on how we can help tone things down in our country. I traveled to Lima, Peru in 1989 as part of our Spanish club. And it really opened my eyes about what other parts of the world deal with. Firstly, we took a bus from the airport to downtown, and I noticed one side of the street was dark and the other one had lights on, and I asked the tour guide, well, why is that? And he pointed out that the Shining Path guerrillas were knocking out power transformers and they had to ration power. And I was like, okay, as a 16-year-old boy. But the point of this story is, walking around town and at our hotel and stuff, armed guards, not just with pistols, but with machine guns, and troop carriers and stuff around the Capitol buildings. And it crossed my mind that hopefully someday that won't come to our country. And it really troubled me when I saw what happened in DC the 6th, because that premonition I had as a young boy, I felt was starting to come to fruition. But on a positive note, I was watching TV this weekend, and Rick Steves was in Ireland because it's St. Patrick's Day. Monday was St. Patrick's Day or Tuesday. And he pointed out how much better things are in Ireland than in the early 80s, which some of us remember the troubles and the bombings that happened then. So this too shall pass. I'm confident in our country and in our state, if we can learn to treat each other with respect and decorum and assume positive intent with our intentions and our works and our words and our deeds. So thank you, members.
Announcements. Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think personal privilege may be done, and an announcement on behalf of Senator Lee and myself. There will be a briefing discussion about the work of the Criminal and Juvenile Justice Commission Monday at adjournment in the old Supreme Court chambers. Briefing and discussion is for anyone, which is, I hope, all of us, and I'm going to even defer and allow Senator Lee to come down and the other senator from Colorado Springs come down and fill out this announcement of the CCJJ briefing Monday at adjournment, old Supreme Court chambers. Do I have that right?
The good senator from El Paso County will first be fined for referring to the good senator from Colorado Springs. Senator Lee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the opportunity, and I thank my colleague from El Paso County for pinch hitting so ably for me. The CCJJ which has been doing extraordinary criminal justice reform proposals for the legislature for a decade, is going to give a briefing to anyone who's interested on Monday upon adjournment. So if you want to hear what's going on in the CCJJ, come join us. It's the Colorado Criminal Juvenile Justice Commission. Everyone welcome, Supreme Court. Thank you. Thank you.
Members, I have one announcement for you. Note that the Senate will be closed for Good Friday, April 2nd, so you can plan accordingly. Also note that it does mean that we will have some longer evenings going into April. But April 2nd, Good Friday, the Senate will be closed. Mr. Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, just a quick announcement. This is going to be your last day to get your General Assembly merchandise in without having to pay for shipping. Just want to let that sink in. So with that, Mr. President, we do have a bill, I think, to read across. Move that the Senate recess until 11:30 a.m.
You have heard the motion. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The Senate will stand in recess until 11:30 today.